So we looked at psychological stress, and the outcome we were looking at was biological aging. And we had a hypothesis going into our study, our clinical trial, that, when people are highly stressed, they're going to age faster. And what we were incredibly surprised to see is that the people that had stress in their life, kind of like a moderate, not overwhelming amount, had a slower biological age than the group that didn't have stress or rated their stress at a lower level.
Welcome to Influence to Death, your guide for navigating the wild world of wellness influencing.
Hi, and welcome to Influence to Death. My name is Victoria Lafont.
I'm Hannah Wright, and today we have a wonderful guest on the podcast, Dr. Sharon Bergquist.
Okay. So here's something, Dr. Bergquist, I didn't even pull up your bio because we keep getting guests who are like, do not read our bio. Didn't even ask you about that before we started. I'm more than happy to read your bio if...
Yeah, you have a great bio. I mean, it's worthwhile to hear.
I'm good with whatever you guys want to do. If you want to, maybe you can even say it in one sentence if you want, or just like a summary, or you can ask me to tell you what I do, whatever you prefer.
Okay, I'm just going to quickly read this on your website.
Okay.
And then I also think it like an interesting story is how we met and that we have this funny Boston connection.
Yeah.
Okay, so Dr. Sharon Bergquist, board certified physician, research scientist, and lifestyle medicine pioneer. And she's leading the movement in preventative care, healthy aging, and lifestyle medicine. And so the synopsis that I would say in the context of this conversation is that you believe that stress is beneficial. And there's context around that, but that's going to be the conversation that we have today, which is a little different than how most people perceive stress. They see it as highly detrimental.
Yes. So Victoria and Hannah, thank you so much for having me on your podcast, and thank you for even having a podcast dedicated on this topic. Kudos to you, and I really appreciate the work that you're doing. And looking at stress, I think that we have a blind spot in medicine. In fact, one of our biggest blind spots is how we see stress. We have for a long time, really going back to the days of Hans Selye, so almost 90 years of stress research on how stress harms. And the harms are real, and it does wreak havoc on every part of our body. But what we haven't asked is what happens when there isn't adequate stress. The assumption has been that if we just bring chronic stress down to a level where it just doesn't harm us, then we are doing well. But what we now know are really twofold. One is that when we don't get enough stress, which is called sus stress, so this entire framework of how we see stress has changed. The harms of that are just as much as getting too much stress, right? So this goal of just lower your stress, well, there is a certain point where we're not getting enough, and we haven't done much to explore that. This has been a very recent area in science and research, really the science of good stress, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But what's even more of a blind spot is this assumption that if we get below a certain threshold that we're just going to not harm. But the reality is that the relationship of harm and stress is not linear. There is a certain Goldilocks zone where stress doesn't just not harm, but it benefits us. So we take off. And the relationship is really more like an inverted U. So if you could picture stress on an x-axis and kind of resilience on the y-axis, instead of it being linear, it's more like a U where not enough and too much are at our lowest points. And somewhere in that middle, that Goldilocks range, we benefit from stress. It builds resilience and it creates growth.
Yes.
So cool. So I
It's
think
so cool.
I'm thinking, like, if I was as a listener listening to this, thinking like more stress, like I'm so stressed. I'm stressed at work. I'm taking care of my kids. I'm getting up early and going to the gym and, not getting enough sleep, and thinking I can't add more stress to my life. How would that benefit me?
Yeah. The predominant stress in our lives is chronic stress, and that is not good stress. The important thing is the type of stress. So, just as our bodies weren't made for chronic stress, we were actually made for needing brief amounts of intermittent stress. And that could be biological, it could be mental, it could be metabolic, it could be chemical. But those types of stressors, which I call good stress, based on the science of hormesis, which is to excite, those stresses are the ones that make us stronger. So you're absolutely right. You cannot take toxic stress and put it in some, amount and make that all of a sudden good for you. You need to be able to differentiate what is a good stressor and what is a bad stressor. And then how do you take less of the bad or remove that from your life, which is, I think, the bucket that most of us work in. And then how do we understand good and increase the amount of good stress? And by doing that, build our resilience so that these inevitable bad stressors that aren't going to go away, no matter how much we try and put effort into curbing and getting rid of, we're not going to get rid of them. Stress is a part of life. So the best we can do is build our resilience. And that's the purpose of the good stress.
As you're saying that, I'm like listening to the horns honk out on Sturo Drive. When we first moved here, I was like, oh my God, what did we do? I remember feeling my eyes were just like dilated. I was in such stress for so many weeks. So yeah, you're right. It's hard we didn't move. That's for sure. I think it might be interesting to maybe tell people how we met, and if you're okay with that.
Of course.
Yeah, just because it was, I think for both of us, we were like, oh, you get it. We were both at the Mindshare Summit in Arizona this past September, and it just happened to be that we started talking and you kind of described your work to me. And I was like, you didn't say the word hormesis, but it's been such an interesting topic for Hannah and I both that I was like, hormesis? And you were like, you know what hormesis is? And I was like, sis, yes. So much. So and to that point, it is kind of a rarer term, although I think more people are becoming familiar with it. And it's a topic that we've covered on this podcast a little bit because it's sort of the story that's not told when people eat like a carnivore diet, or, they like will cut out, for instance, like plants I know that's a huge, it's like one of the 5 main like good stresses that you cover in your book, because they are quote unquote toxic. And it's like, yeah, but the part that we never get to is that little bit of beneficial stress is actually really good for the body. And some, not all, but some carnivore folks never get to that part. They just say it's toxic, and then that second part that's really important gets left out. So yeah, it was this fun, I came home and told my husband, I was like, I heard this woman's name and I was like, where have I seen that name before? And it's because your name was on these research papers that we were reading on hormesis, and on this topic. So it was just lovely and serendipitous.
Wasn't, on my end, I was equally surprised because I sometimes avoid using the word hormesis because no one's heard of it and it seems very obscure. And just the fact that you knew what it meant, my eyes just lit up. So my goal and my mission is to get hormesis to a tipping point where it's mainstream, and where that term already carries all this information that we're going to talk about related to good stress and what we need to know about it.
That would
And
be
I
wonderful.
feel like I'm talking a lot.
No, I'm holding back on my questions because I don't want to just like dump everything out right at the beginning. But So hormesis, I never knew about what it was until graduate school. And I was just mind blown because prior to that, it was all about, more like working with clients, like you don't want to be in fight or flight. You need to be able to balance your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And so I was more focused on like stress bad, like reduce the stressors, and learning about how little tiny good stressors affect your body and have this kind of snowball effect in all these beneficial ways was really eye-opening to me. And so for the listeners, would you explain what hormesis is and what hormetic stressors are?
Yeah, and I'll say that, Hannah, most of my colleagues in medicine have never heard of hormesis.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, even when my colleagues ask me, what is the book about? And I mention, have you heard of hormesis? I usually get a blank response. So I think it's kind of across the board, even in health professionals. So I'm happy to talk and describe it. So hormesis is the science of good stress. It's how mild to moderate amounts of certain kinds of stress followed by recovery make us more resilient. And it's really important to emphasize this recovery piece because so often we talk about, well, what's the good kind of stress or how should I avoid stress? The key is that when we are experiencing these types of brief intermittent stressors, our bodies go into a stress resistant mode where they start to do some housekeeping to make them run more efficiently. And it is in the recovery that we rebuild and remodel and become stronger. So, stress alone is not going to get us to a better and stronger state. It's the stress followed by recovery. And it's the recovery where our body molds, adapts, and gets ready for a similar subsequent challenge. So, it's this yin and yang, stress and recovery in these small doses that get us to that highest point.
That is, I think, so key because it's left out. Like, I don't want to pick on people too hard, but when we like get up at 4 a.m. and we like do our weightlifting and our cold plunge and we get in the sauna and then we never eat food. It's like you never see that from an influence perspective. Then it's like, oh, and like then sometimes we eat like, spaghetti squash with lots of olive oil and salt and like my favorite, Sharon, it's like this running joke is I love eating waffles in the bathtub. There's this like warm, wonderful bath, and then you just get to eat this like delicious pastry in the bathtub. Like there has to be these times when we're not just on going as hard as we can. I think that that's not something that I see very often.
And I think that is the key because you can even take a good stress like a cold plunge or a sauna. And if you do it for too long or too cold, you make it a chronic stress. You can actually pass the threshold at which your body actually benefits. And some of the reason behind that, from a physiologic standpoint, is when we encounter any stress by definition is something that challenges our body. And at a more physiologic level, it's something that disrupts our natural balance, our homeostatic balance. Our bodies need to reestablish that balance. And that process takes some energy in itself just to reestablish balance. It's the remaining energy that our body's capable of using towards hormetic growth. But if you disrupt that balance so much, like there is a certain point where the energy is really, kind of put past the point where we have any left for growth. And we're just essentially recovering from the stressors. So with any hormetic stress, when it's a tiny amount and then we reestablish balance, we can gain about 20 to 25% improvement from an exposure.
Wow.
And this has been tested across thousands of stimulants, across plants, animals. Now, through repetitive exposure, small incremental amounts followed by recovery, so stress recovery, stress recovery, stress recovery, we can increase our human potential 60 to 90%. So we can almost double our human potential, right? So many of us kind of live our lives just leaving a lot on the table.
Yeah.
We really don't maximize, and we really sell ourselves short. And I think this is really a way for people to navigate the situation they're in, right? So often now, there's so many things, as you've already mentioned, that are creating stress in our lives. And what we fail to realize is that we don't just passively build resilience. Like, we can actively be a part of how the stress affects us.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about tiny amounts, how tiny is that? Is it seconds of exposure, minutes? Does it just depend on the activity or the whatever your good stress is?
Yeah. So intuitively, we all know that we have different thresholds for anything, whether it's, stress, that's temperature, whether it's how much plant chemicals we can eat. Some people have different GI systems, whether it's how much we can exercise. So rather than thinking in exact amounts, like, we should all do 15 seconds of cold, etc., what you really want to do is you want to go slightly past your comfort zone, but not to the point where you feel overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
So that is really going to be the case for every person. And we all just start at a different baseline. So if you have a certain amount of cold tolerance, I'll pick on Victoria because you are living in New England. You probably have a high amount of cold tolerance.
You'd think it'd be better. But actually, today, my husband wanted to go to the Christmas tree lighting in Seaport. And I called him and I was like, I don't think I can do this. I have to stay home.
So, but you potentially may have more than someone living in Florida. So for you, it may take 30 seconds at the end of a cold shower. And for me, it may be 15 seconds. It's just we all have a different amount. So rather than thinking of a specific amount of time, a specific temperature, a specific level of exercise, or a specific workout, just think about it depending on where you are, what starts to feel uncomfortable.
Okay.
And I think that's really the key. And that for any individual is going to be a moving target, right? Because as you stress recover, your body's adapting to that stressor. So it's going to take more to reach that threshold. But that is what you want. That adaptation is what benefits you.
Okay.
It kind of reminds me of like some yoga classes, like good teachers will talk about how it's like you want to stretch to where it feels like you're kind of on the edge, like you're not going to hurt yourself, but you're not just like hanging out in a pose. You're like at that point, and it's different for every person.
It is. And the premise behind this is bioplasticity, right? So if you want to grow, you have to essentially push yourself. And the body, it's really the biological equivalent of use it or lose it, right? So if you want to get good at doing yoga, like you have to stretch past a certain point, but not too much, then recover, stretch again, recover. And the body essentially adapts and molds. And we do it at every level, right? We not only do it in our ligaments and our muscles, which is probably the framework that we're most familiar with, but we are doing the same with our gut microbiome. Like if you cannot take a certain amount of fiber right now, or you don't do well with beans, well, the more you eat beans in small quantities followed by recovery, the more you build that specific species of gut bacteria that can help ferment that particular fiber. Same with our brains. The more we expose ourselves to some type of mental challenge, the more we stimulate brain-derived neurotrophic factor, we create growth between the communication between the neurons in our brain, and we release neurosteroids like DHEA. And during recovery, our brains remodel in ways that the communication between neurons is stronger, and it helps us remember how we handled that stress before. So neuroplasticity, bioplasticity, our body essentially just takes the stimulus, the stressor, and it molds accordingly. And if we don't use it, we lose it. So it's that simple. And that's really why we need a threshold amount of good stress, just to keep our bodies resilient and prepared.
Yeah. So cool.
I feel like, God, I have so many questions.
Mm-hmm.
I just say that like every time we meet. I'm like, wait. This might be a little early to ask, but do you, and I have never really seen a lot of research on this, but I'm not in the field. Do you see that females need different inputs and different, it's different for females than it is for males?
Yeah. And so the science of good stress is a much younger science. As we were talking about before, we have almost a century of research on how stress harms and what bad stress is. We are just learning good stress. And what we know, for example, is let's take intermittent fasting or time restricted eating as a form of stress. A lot of those early studies have not been done in very diverse populations. So we can't extrapolate for. So there are some unknowns. For example, we don't have a lot of data on people who are younger than 18 or over 65. We have far less data on women and even less so on postmenopausal women. So, yes, I think that we can't always assume that the same effect is going to happen by gender, by age, probably by a lot of variabilities that make us all different. And hopefully, as the exponential increase in the number of studies in the area of hormesis continues, we will have more data. When you look at the trajectory of the studies on this area, I will say that the word hormesis really was coined in 1943. There were two forestry researchers, John Ehrlich and Chester Southam, and they were in the woods, and they came upon this cedar wood extract that was toxic to fungus. And they assumed, this is wood decaying fungus, and they were looking at, well, what's the amount that they can use of it, to essentially kill the fungus. And what they found is just by different doses, that there were some doses where the fungus was actually growing and getting stimulated. And they published their findings in 1943 for the first time using the term hormesis to excite, to represent this growth from the fungus that they were testing. So since that time, there have been growing use of the term, in toxicology. Botanists have been using it. It's been used in agriculture and in pharmacology as well. The number of references in the medical literature has literally just become exponential in the last 2 decades. It went from a term that, if we even went back further, I think you probably read about this in the early chapter of my book, but hormesis was really first discovered in the late 1800s for a lot of reasons that pitted traditional medicine against homeopathy.
Right.
It was kind of not given the space or time to be researched. And the recurrence really came out of fields outside of medicine and public health. So through fields like toxicology and botany and pharmacology, there's this growth of medical literature. And it's now thousands of studies using the term or referencing this phenomena, which is essentially a fundamental law of biology. And it's now making its way full circle back to medicine and public health. But the pace of the increase has been logarithmic. So I think that we are going to see a lot more studies looking now at subgroups, as we have really appreciated that this is a repeated phenomena.
And I just remembered, I want to make sure people know where they can pre-order this book that we're talking about. Is it okay if I show the cover?
Of course.
Okay, I just didn't know. So we got the galley copy, which is like what I've been hanging out with on airplanes for the past few weeks. And then, if people want to, they can go to drsharonbergquist.com. So it's bergquist.com, and you can pre-order the book, The Stress Paradox. So I just want to stick that in there before the end of the episode where, maybe people drop off or like that, so that they can support you in this awesome work.
Yeah, and because in your book you talk about is it 5 different types of the good stress and how to kind of incorporate it into your life, and it's very practical, information that anyone can use.
And it's a lot of research, but it's so narrative. We talked about this a little bit before the podcast started, but it's like a really interesting story. Like you were saying, the story with the cedarwood extract and the fungus. It's like, oh, it's cool. It's really fun to read.
Well, thanks for the shout out, and I really appreciate that. And yes, so the 5 main stressors that I cover are plant toxins, and we can explain why that's a good stress.
Our listeners know that plants are super toxic,
but in a good way.
Yeah.
And high intensity exercise and how that confers a very unique benefit above and beyond moderate intensity exercise. Thermal stress, which is cold stress, as well as sauna and heat. Food, or I should say metabolic stress from essentially fasting, although I think the term fasting needs an overhaul. I'm going to call it normal eating, and what we're doing, the aberrant behavior of eating around the clock, but some degree of just kind of pausing from eating nutrients as a stress to our body in a beneficial way. And then mental and psychological stress. So that's the type of stress that I think people think of when they think of stress, even though stress is really anything that challenges the body, like we said, whether it's psychological or physical or chemical. I think our mindset focuses on the psychological. And the beauty of all this is when we talk about resilience, or when people say the term resilience, I think historically it's been a little mushy. Like, what are we talking about? Like, we're building resilience. Do we need to be tough, etc.? But resilience is our capacity. And when we are doing hormesis, we're not just building this psychological phenomena of resilience. We're explaining it at a physiologic level. Okay, so where the mind and the body and all the stress converge is at the level of the cell. And I want to explain to everybody who reads the book or hears this that we are now taking a phenomena that has long been in the realm of psychology, stress and resilience, and really bringing it to the physiologic realm of what is happening in our body, the connections in our body to our cells that is making us stronger, so that we can, in a very concrete way, appreciate how we are changing when we face adversity.
Yeah, Hannah, you and I were trained like the stress bucket.
Right. Yeah. And
so it's like a different way to view it. I mean, how kind of you said at the beginning, stress is bad, get out of sympathetic into parasympathetic for good digestion, and all these things. And it's like, it's just a very different take.
One thing that has emerged that I don't think has been communicated well about stress and stress research is that we don't just have one stress response. The reason we fear stress is because we think that all stress causes a fight or flight response. And that is not true. We have many stress responses. So if you are stressed because you have to give let's say a talk about something you're passionate about, the hormones and the neurotransmitters you release from that stress response will also include dopamine, which is very motivating, endocannabinoids, probably oxytocin if you're bonding with the people that you're speaking with. It is very different than just cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine, fight or flight, right? These are all stress recovery hormones. If anything, they net in a way that kind of regulates our stress response. So not all stress harms. In fact, these hormones and neurotransmitters are so beneficial to us that they keep us motivated. They, they really fulfill us, and they don't have the biological harm. So it is so important to realize that we don't have just one stress response. We do not need to fear stress. I do think we need to understand what are the types that we need to avoid and which are the ones that release a more favorable biochemical response. But I think we haven't spent really time as healthcare professionals, no matter how we've all been trained. I mean, I was trained the same, right? Here's your fight or flight response. This is the sympathetic, this is the parasympathetic nervous system. But I think we need to move beyond that. And then there's so many layers to this, right? Besides the autonomic nervous system response, there are local responses. We have cellular responses, and they operate on a different time scale and have a very different effect on our body. So stress and how our body responds is so much more complicated and nuanced than how we appreciate it.
That's so incredible. I mean, here, just thinking that there are different ways, different stress responses is incredible. I'm thinking about, with what you just said, it makes me think about the person who, I'm one of those people who says yes to everything. They're like, yes, I'll help organize that fundraiser. Yes, I'll help you plan this party. Yes, and you can tell they're a little stressed and you're like, why do you keep saying yes? Like, why are you still doing these things? Just say no and take a day off and don't do anything. And I wonder if it's that, your body craving, I mean, apart from not having boundaries, I guess, but like just you craving those positive hormones and neurotransmitters from, even though it's a little stressful, you're bonding with your community, you're getting, influx of dopamine and serotonin and all of those beneficial things.
Absolutely. So, one of my practices here includes a lot of people who are senior level executives, like CEOs, including of some of the Fortune 500 companies, and they, most of the patients I work with have a very objectively stressful life.
Mm-hmm.
However, they are so passionate about what they do. They're so mission driven. And that is what affects the hormone response from our stress response. So when stress aligns with your purpose, when you feel that what you are doing, when you said yes, is meaningful, then it's really an exciting and exhilarating kind of stress. But when the stress doesn't align with your belief system, so you said yes to something, but it was really just someone who got you to do something that your heart was telling you, I don't want to do this. That is the kind of stress you want to say no to, because that type of stress, essentially your body realizes it doesn't align. And when there's a disconnect between what your values are and how your actions, that dysregulates your stress response, right? Essentially, it's lying to yourself. That's how your body perceives it. There's that much of a disconnect and dyssynchrony that's being created. And that is why you get the inflammation from that type of stress and a lot of the harm. But when there is that alignment, you can pursue stress. And if one person asks you, objectively from their standpoint, why do you do this? They're not in your shoes and they don't really know what it is that feeds your soul. But as long as it does, I think that you don't need to fear or say no.
That is such good advice. How incredible to think about it that way, because you don't hear that, that those good things about it.
And Sharon, that was your direct bench research was on this topic, right?
Yeah, so we looked at psychological stress, and the outcome we were looking at was biological aging. And we had a hypothesis going into our study, our clinical trial, that, when people are highly stressed, they're going to age faster. And what we were incredibly surprised to see is that the people that had stress in their life, kind of like a moderate, not overwhelming amount, had a slower biological age than the group that didn't have stress or rated their stress at a lower level. Now, that depended on their resilience. So what was really interesting to us is we also looked at resilience, because you can't just take the same level of stress without looking at the person's baseline resilience, like we were talking about before. There's so much bioindividuality. So in interestingly enough, in people who had lower resilience, we found that the stress was beneficial. So a little interesting, a lot of counterintuitive findings, but yes, we have actually looked at that and found a hormetic association.
Oh, so cool. Oh my
Yeah,
God.
it's totally so cool. There's a story in your book that illustrates this to me, where you talk about when you were, I don't know like the right name, like maybe you were an intern in medical school here in Boston, and so you were just like working 36-hour shifts and 7 days a week, but like you were living in Beacon Hill, which, so this was another interesting connection when we met. I live like the route that you would walk home from your job to your apartment passes right in front of my apartment because you lived over in Beacon Hill. So I was like, it's just so weird. Like, sometimes with the universe, I'm like, what is happening? And number one, it's just cold as hell in the wintertime. But then, yes, like our building was built like in the 1830s, I think, and some in Beacon Hill are even older. And
Wow.
so sometimes the infrastructure is not great. And so you woke up one morning and you had to take this super cold shower. It's all that you had. But then that day you were like, okay, I'm n equals 1, but I feel better. Like this helped me somehow, even though you had what might at that time, if you were, I'm guessing, like in your 20s, like I think most people in their 20s pretty resilient, but like you were under so much chronic stress, but you had this like immediate, acute stressor that we know is beneficial from the thermal stress, and you could feel this positive effect.
Yeah, what's so interesting, Victoria, is I did my residency at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston in the 1990s. We did not have any of the stress research data that we do today. So it was so interesting that my N of 1 experiment happened before we even understood stress. There was one of the most frequently quoted studies on what happens with cold exposure. Actually came out in 2000. And in that study, it was actually done in a group of 10 men. So again,
Yeah.
I'm going to extrapolate to a female here. Um, but with the stress exposure, there was a 5-fold increase of norepinephrine, and dopamine went up 250%.
Oh my God.
And, that really explained to me what I was feeling, right? That level of alertness, because when the cutaneous nerves feel the cold, our sensory nerves send the signal of stress to our brain, and it is like a jolt because it is so cold. So it shoots up the norepinephrine level. And in the study, they measured serum norepinephrine and dopamine. But interestingly, some of that norepinephrine is actually also made in the brain. So there's still some questions, right? Because some of the serum, at that point, they're hormones. How did they get in the brain? It's not clear that they would cross into the blood-brain barrier, but we actually also make norepinephrine in the brain from the cold exposure. And that sends a jolt. And then, of course, this big increase in dopamine is very rewarding and motivating. And even though the levels do go down shortly after the stress exposure, there is a more enduring effect throughout the day that you can feel from the change in the morning showers. And that's the effect from one exposure. What's really interesting is with repeat exposure, what we see, and some of the studies have seen even with 4 weeks of repeat exposure, is that the cortisol level actually goes below baseline. So even though, you would assume that these stressors are increasing, cortisol, what's fascinating is even in that 2000 study, there was a uptick in norepinephrine, but not in epinephrine and not in cortisol. So the stress response, like we're saying, is very different than the fight or flight, which, as people may or may not know, is triggered when the amygdala in our brain senses threat, communicates that. We release the epinephrine and dopamine, and then epinephrine and norepinephrine activate the hypothalamic adrenal axis until our adrenal glands continue to make the stress hormones and make cortisol. But clearly, when we are triggering it with our peripheral nervous system sensing the stress and communicating to our brain, the biochemical response is very different. And again, we net a lower level. Same with high intensity interval training, right? Of course, it shoots up cortisol, but if you look at the effect of cortisol like later in the day, and then of course after repeat high intensity interval trainings, the baseline level of cortisol is actually lower. So again, there's so much terminology now of, oh no, it's raising your cortisol or it's spiking your cortisol. Yeah. Sometimes that's okay. Like that's the path to getting to that more resilient state and having that better baseline.
So something that I feel like I know I've recommended and I hear it is if someone is living a more stress inducing lifestyle, they have a heavy workload, they have interpersonal stress, whatever it is, to recommend that they avoid things like high intensity exercise or even like extreme temperatures. Like, I wouldn't recommend you should take a cold shower because that would stress you more, or things like that are actually good stressors, as we're learning. So for someone who has an overflowing amount of bad stress in their life, it sounds like those things that seem like they would stress you out are beneficial to incorporate as long as you feel good while you're doing it. Like you judge your personal threshold, I guess.
Right. Absolutely. Sometimes a person does need recovery, and I want to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that we're still, emphasizing the importance that if a person is just so overwhelmed, run down, if they're not sleeping, I mean, they're
Mm-hmm.
not getting adequate recovery. And adding an extra hit training, not necessarily going to have the same level of benefit, although there are now studies showing that the metabolic adverse effects of sleep deprivation can to some degree be negated by high intensity interval training. So, um,
Oh, wow. I did not know that. That is really
That's
cool.
yeah.
amazing.
So I think, there is a really important need for recovery. It's not gonna, you can't just good stress your way out of not sleeping and
Mm-hmm.
eating crud and, et cetera. But I also think that sometimes we get stuck in how do I work my way to a better state where I feel better,
Mm-hmm.
where my brain functions better, where my mood is better, and I feel a greater sense of calm. And if you can't meditate your way to that state, I mean, some people are good at that, other people aren't. If you can't, say no or limit the number of stressors in your life because they're beyond your control, that another pathway to getting to that point of calm and happier is by doing small incremental amounts of good stress.
Mm-hmm.
And of course you can start with a smaller amount, right? Like what we're talking about, it maybe it's 5 seconds at the end of a shower that's colder, right? But just starting somewhere. And what is really just so powerful is the good stress sets off a chain reaction in your body. And that slowly makes you more confident, happier. It starts to transform you at a biological level, right? This is not just mindset work. This is your physiology changing. And the more you start to feel good, I think you become better at even knowing how to handle all the stress in your life. Sometimes people are so overwhelmed that they can't find their way out. They don't even know how to say no to certain things because
Mm-hmm.
they're so overwhelmed that they can't even step back and say, what can I say no to?
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you just have to work your way there by doing these small good stressors, and you get the clarity by really reintroducing to your body what feels good, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that just starts to reinforce itself.
I
I
love
can like
that.
intuitively feel that.
Yes, that's what I was that part of the intuition and like listening to your heart and like what you're telling yourself. That's so
Mm-hmm.
critical.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's something that I think might help if people are listening and they're still a little bit like, I'm not sure about this. And please, Sharon, like direct me if this doesn't sound right. But like the beneficial stress that most of us are most familiar with is exercise. And
Mm-hmm.
likely all of us have had the experience where we are super stressed out, sleep deprived. I will skip breakfast when I need to kind of be eating more calories sometimes to like work and like drink a little caffeine instead so I could just keep going. But then when I go to the gym, I always feel better. Now, I think the phenomenon that would be interesting to touch on is the group of people that I think is small, but is an interesting and important question, where it's like they actually do feel worse when they exercise, and they do feel worse when they eat plants. It's like they have like such a low resilience or some type of, I mean, I've actually looked in the research literature, like at a biochemical level, to see like, is it something that's up with like their inflammatory responses? Like, I don't want to get too crazy nerdy, but like the PGC1A pathway is like altered somehow. Like, what is happening with those people? But from a bigger picture view, the majority of us, when we get home from the gym, we're like, okay, that was good. That was like, a good idea to go and do that. But I am curious what you think about the people who, they're like, I don't have any exercise. I don't know what it's called. It's like
Tolerance, like exercise intolerance. Yeah.
exactly.
And to your point, there are going to be people who have food intolerances and food allergies and, different gastrointestinal disorders. Because I work with patients who are, run the gamut. Some actually have orthopedic limitations to doing certain forms of exercise. The beauty of good stress is a phenomenon called cross adaptation. The basis of this is what we are doing is we're fundamentally making your cells healthier. Okay, our cells are the building blocks of our body. We have over 30 trillion cells. And when we expose our cells to good stress, our cells repair, they renew themselves, they regenerate, they heal themselves. And the cells, can be differentiated in our body. So neurons in our brain affect how we think and how we feel. A cell in our heart affects our circulation. A cell in our skeletal muscle affects our strength. When we are making our cells healthier, we are making our whole body healthier. And if we are doing that by exposing our body to high intensity interval training or a plant toxin or cold or heat or through intermittent fasting, we are still converging at the level of the cell. So you can start with something physical as a stressor and become stronger mentally. You can start with a mental challenge, become stronger physically.
Right.
And interestingly enough, a convergence point within the cell is actually the mitochondria. So if you are exercising at a high intensity,
Yeah, you got to show us your T-shirt.
Yes, yes.
And for the listeners,
I'm going to give credit to this is from Rhonda Patrick's story. So
I was wondering if it was. Okay, yeah.
So full credit, mitochondriac. But the mitochondria are really huge in all of this, because when you are really pushing your cells, you are giving your cells the stimulus to do what's called mitohormesis. Essentially, you are developing more mitochondria. You go through not only mitochondrial biogenesis to create more mitochondria, but you go through mitophagy, which is a process where we clean out old and damaged mitochondria and kind of replace them with healthier ones. We either fuse or through fission and fusion create healthier mitochondria. And mitochondria affect our metabolism. They affect every cellular function. They essentially power our cells to do the work that they need to do. So the interesting part is, in recent years, we've learned mitochondria aren't just the, quote, powerhouse of our cells. They don't just play a role in our metabolism, but they are the communication hub within our body. Mitochondria are talking to each other, creating a power grid. And they also communicate to other biological systems. Our circadian rhythm communicates through our mitochondria. We're seeing our immune system communicates with our mitochondria. Our gut microbiome communicates with mitochondria. So when you have healthy mitochondria, the communication network is affected. And what's even more fascinating is the neurotransmitters that we're talking about, like serotonin, norepinephrine, they're made in the mitochondria of the cell. So if you're using exercise to make your mitochondria healthier, you are actually improving your stress response. And vice versa, right? If stress isn't damaging your mitochondria, like psychological stress, you're going to have healthier mitochondria to power your metabolism.
Mm-hmm.
So there's such an intimate connection between our body, right? Like this is a systems biology approach to becoming healthier,
Yeah.
right? And we can leverage the cross adaptation where if a person can't do a plant toxin or they have dietary restrictions, they have orthopedic restrictions, well, we know that sauna mimics the effect of
Mm-hmm.
exercise, right? We can raise our heart rate and blood pressure literally to the same level as moderate to vigorous intensity exercise just by sitting in a sauna.
Mm-hmm.
That may be the entry point to building cellular resilience.
Awesome.
And sometimes that may make it easier for a person to introduce a stressor that they couldn't before.
So
Fabulous.
cool.
Can I say you have such a beautiful explanation for the most complex? I mean, everything you're describing is so complicated, but the way that you explain it, it's just very easy. It's digestible,
Thank
and
you.
that's your book is like that. It's like
Yeah.
very easy to read and understand.
Oh, thank you very much.
I know. I'm like
Yeah.
PGC1A pathways. She's like, hang on there a second.
Well, but what you're really touching on, Victoria, is how does stress communicate with our cells, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are master regulators, right? We have signaling molecules, and essentially stress speaks to our body and it speaks to our cells through these, master regulators like the PGC1 alpha or through signaling molecules. And that's how the communication is happening. So all of these master regulators are so important as we try and unravel really what's a maze of a network of how the communications are happening between ourselves. So I think they're super important. But if we really are stepping back, we're saying, look, here's the process. Stress exposure releases signaling molecules. It triggers and activates master regulators. You flip certain switches inside the cells that leads to different sets of genes getting expressed. And it is those gene programs that are what are building our resilience. So those gene programs turn on adversity pathways that we now know are what make us all like healthier and stronger.
And our kids too, right?
Yeah.
Like I just remember years ago researching for this, like, God, it was like the like adaptation response that, I mean, it is so weird, like the serendipity around this. Do you remember, Hannah, years ago, NTA had this, it was like a sports summit day. This was a long time ago. And I did this talk about performance adaptations, which at the time I didn't know my butt from a hole in the ground. We just knew just a little bit, and they like let me get up there, but like I pulled it together, but touched on this work because with athletes, this has been looked at where exercise creates this adaptation. You want the stress of the exercise to lead to that adaptation, and you can halt that if you, let's say, somebody is really competitive. You do not want to give them even antioxidant-rich foods in certain windows because it can halt that adaptation. Yeah, and I just remember, reading about this back then, and in that research, seeing like that genetic, I mean, it would be considered epigenetic effect. It gets passed on to our offspring.
Yeah, that's so cool. I've thought about that and just all of us in general since being a mom. And, right before I became pregnant, I stopped this because I was pregnant. I played roller derby. And so I was getting really high intensity exercise many times a week.
Hannah was a badass.
I mean, at times I would wonder, is this good for us, like myself and my teammates? Because it's really intense. I mean, your heart rate goes up really high. It's like for 2 minutes usually, or 5 minutes, and then you rest. And then you keep doing that and keep doing that. And then I had my son, and I was like, I wonder if this is going to benefit him, that I had that before, and then, right before when he was conceived. And
Did
I also
you find out you were pregnant because you got hurt at roller
I did,
derby?
yeah. So I had to go to the ER just to make sure I didn't break something, and that's how I found out. Yeah.
That's such a great story.
And then I thought about this again this morning, actually. I thought about you, Dr. Bergquist, because my son goes to an outdoor preschool, So he's outside, and we had the cold weather come in pretty hard. And so it was about 20 degrees this morning, and it felt like it was like maybe 18 or less. And, I'm like bundling him up, and I gave him the option. I was like, it's very cold, so if you want to stay home, you can. And he was like, I want to go to school. And I was like, okay. And I just thought about that with the cold exposure, and of course, when I picked him up, his little hands were warm. He was totally fine because
Well, he probably still has brown
4-year-old.
fat. Well, he's got brown fat.
Exactly.
Right.
Also brown adipose
Right.
tissue. Yeah. So
That's
he's
totally
always
true.
just a little heater all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely an epigenetic effect. So how the good stressors affect our genes. So what we're talking about are longevity genes, and longevity genes, which are also called vita genes, which is short for vitality genes, are conserved gene programs that have been handed down to us now for generations and generations. And when we get exposed to good stressors, like you with your high intensity, or your son today, there are two things that happen that affect our gene expression. So one is that, like you just mentioned, we get epigenetic alterations. So the exposure essentially methylates certain areas of our genes or histone proteins in our genome, and that turns on or off certain genes and affects gene expression. And epigenetic changes can get passed down a generation, and maybe a generation or two. We don't know exactly how long, not indefinitely, because we're not changing the genome. And then the other way is that the stress activates transcription factors. So these are proteins that sit inside our cells, but under normal conditions, they're inactive and just sitting there. And when we get exposed to a stressor, that transcription factor goes to the nucleus where our genes are, where our DNA is. They attach to specific parts of our DNA that turn on a specific gene program related to these longevity genes. And that's more of a short-term changing of our gene program. And the epigenetics are happening on a longer time scale where our body builds the memory of that stress exposure. And this is why, people have passive resilience, right? We have been exposed to so many things in childhood. So maybe the good stress exposure from the cold for your son today, but maybe tomorrow someone will hurt his feelings, and it won't be a good stress. And we are really epigenetically the accumulation of all these exposures, and that's what builds our passive resilience. And really what I hope that people take away is that you can actively change that, right? Resilience is a muscle, and that you can build it. So you can epigenetically continue to alter it in a purposeful manner. So not just what happens to us, but what we do to make that change happen.
Yeah, I want to respect your time. I have so many, I'm sure Hannah too, have so many more questions. That was a pretty great sum up, though.
It really
right
was.
there.
Perfect takeaway.
I want to be like, where do you think the mitochondria come from? Are we like aliens? Like, were they bacteria?
Well, one of the coolest things, though, Victoria, is if you guys just, I don't know what your biology books look like, Hannah or Victoria, but my biology book in high school showed the cell with one mitochondria and one of each of the organelles.
Yes.
And we now know that a cell can have anywhere from 1 to thousands of mitochondria, right? Like, we can power our cells and power our bodies in such profound ways that I think, the importance of doing that and changing how our body functions is just so important. I mean, we kind of live life on the defense, and we need to play the game on the offense, right? And that's what good stress is all about.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's what your book teaches people how to do.
Well, I hope, and I think this is all manageable. I want people to also understand that what I'm advocating is small microdoses, everyday stress, like 15 seconds at the end of a shower. Like, can you do 30 seconds of high intensity? Can you do 5 seconds of high intensity? But following that with recovery, but it's these little microdoses. I mean, there's studies showing that even just like running up a flight of stairs has a dramatic benefit in terms of intense exposure, kind of the minimum threshold amount that we need. So these are small, everyday things that we can all do. We're not asking for, stress with capital S, but stress with little
Yeah.
s.
Yeah.
And that just understanding how much those little things make such a difference on the inside. I feel like we're kind of conditioned to expect to see these big results when we're like adding anything into our routine, you know? I mean, that's just how like wellness and marketing works. But these little tiny things, the 15, seconds of something, like doing the flight of stairs, parking farther away at the grocery store and power walking all the way to the store, something to get your heart rate up, even if you don't notice like, oh, my muscles are sore, or I, lost an inch off my waist or something like that. Those markers that we're conditioned to look for, those things internally are changing. It's benefiting your mitochondria and your inflammation and all that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you just have to trust the process.
Yeah.
And I think that if you do, you are amazed at where you are, not, necessarily immediately afterwards, although I do think you feel better in the short term as well. But when you look at the trajectory you just have to trust the process. You have to trust your body. I think we have lost sight of how wise and capable our bodies are. I mean, I'm in the field of medicine. I take care of patients every day. And I think there's been so much introduction of medications and procedures that this intuitive, of what your body needs and the trust in the wisdom of our bodies. I mean, our bodies are brilliant, right? And if you just trust that process and trust your body, you can really do a lot to guide yourself towards health.
Yeah. That's awesome.
You're awesome.
Yeah,
I could listen
totally.
to you talk all day long. This is
You guys are
wonderful.
awesome.
So I just want to reiterate where you can find Dr. Bergquist. So it's drsharonbergquist.com. Her book, just going to show it one more time, is The Stress Paradox. And so you can pre-order now, but it'll be available in March of 2025.
That's right. March 25th is the day that it will be available. Very excited. Appreciate everyone's support. You can also follow me on social media at The Good Stress Doctor. I'm on Instagram. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Facebook, X. But The Good Stress Doctor. If you guys ever have questions, reach out anytime. I think that this is really an area that can help people in ways that most people are not yet aware. And I look forward to hearing from people or anybody reaching out with questions related to the science behind this.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh,
Yes,
thank you so much for having me. And thank you again for the work you do. I love the premise of your podcast. I think not only is it just a clever title, but I think the mission of your podcast is so needed right now. I think it's a very crowded space with all the information that's getting communicated. And there is so much labels and words that don't carry the humility and the iterative process that happens in the process and journey of scientific exploration. So I really appreciate your commitment to starting something that hopefully will kind of break down some of these kind of groups and camps and ideologies. Because at the end of the day, I mean, we all, in the world of science and medicine have to have this humility that everything that we know is based on the knowledge that we have today, and that will change. And so thank you for having a forum, for having people on to ask the questions that you're asking.
Thank you so much.
That just made my year.
I know.
Yeah, I mean, look, we see that in your book. There's actually a passage I read today and I was like, damn, you have a lot of humility in doing the work that you're doing. So right back at you.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good one. It was so wonderful to have you, Dr. Bergquist.
Thank you so much.